Hello and welcome to Africa 360. I'm your host, Kwangu Liwewe. I'm an African, 4 words that resonate through the continent in celebration of all that's good about Africa and its people. But what does it mean to be an African in this post-colonial day and age? Do we continue to be haunted by our past and defined by external powers? And what does the future really hold for Africa and its people? Africa 360 producer Lindy Mdongana explores the iconic phrase.
On an occasion such as this, we should perhaps start from the beginning. So let me begin. I am an African.
An inspiring speech by former South African President Thabo Mbeki. The sentiment, an affirmation of the African spirit, the restoration of African pride, and a rejection of stereotypical representations of Africa as a land of corrupt despots, incurable diseases, and merciless desperation. Mbeki's speech is a contribution to a post-colonial definition of what it means to be an African. While traditional media platforms may be stubborn to change, it seems the internet, a playground of ideas and information, is where young tech-savvy Africans are turning to rewrite the African narrative. From blogs to websites, videos and social media pages, the internet has become a platform for African self-expression.
Young Africans and young black people all over the world actually are using the internet to tell their own stories, to see reflections of themselves, authentic reflections of themselves, and also taking back the control of who tells our stories.
It's an emerging league of extraordinary African storytellers that stretches across the continent and into the diaspora. Their perspective is fresh and daring. They reveal new trends and they don't shy away from confronting Africa's challenges.
What's up, Africa?
Sometimes with a little humor, like What's Up, Africa? A video blog created by British-Nigerian satirical journalist Ikena Azwike.
When something terrible happens and the nation is waiting for you to act, but you have other pressing issues to consider, use the good luck prioritization matrix.
Milisutando Bongela says this generation is making history.
I think in 50 years' time, people will look back on this period as the time that a global black identity, kind of that's untethered to the past and what blackness was in the past and what the narrow parameters that blackness has existed within before.
Stereotypes of the past have no place here. Only authentic representations of the present and the future, in which Africans speak for themselves. It may be some time before there is a fundamental shift in the way the world sees Africa. But the efforts of contemporary writers and creatives bring us a step closer to Mbeki's vision. A rich and empowering self-assertion of what it means to be an African.
Africa is a continent of 54 countries and has over 1 billion people. But even in the year 2014, the continent is cloaked in mystery and misinformation. With a past that echoes louder than the present, are we as Africans claiming an identity that speaks to the future of our continent? Well, to help me answer that question, I'm joined now in studio by 2 guests. A warm welcome to Trevor, who is the Executive Deputy Chairman of the Mail and Guardian, and our very own ENCA's resident commentator, Angelo Fick. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us on the show today. Now, Trevor, if we look at traditional Western media, they've portrayed Africa as a sad continent. They talk about corruption, disease. We're always looked at as victims, war-torn. Is this still the way they're portraying the continent?
I think it is the way they're portraying the continent because I think, in all fairness, some of those things still take place on the continent, you know, disease, starvation, and poverty. But I think we are at a point where us as Africans are beginning to say, hey, yes, that is true, but there's a lot of good stuff that's taking on the continent, and let's begin to focus on those things. I think also the realization that we've been criticizing the Western media for covering us the way they are doing, and that has not resulted in any change in terms of how they're covering us, and it will never change. So it's pointless for us to continue criticizing them and trying to shout them down or shut them down. What we ought to be doing is telling the African story the way we would want to be told. It doesn't mean that we hide the poverty. It doesn't mean that we hide the coups and the sickness and disease and all that kind of stuff. It means that we, as the indigenous people, as the Africans on this continent, we know the wonderful things that are taking place. And we're saying, let's focus the attention on those things that tell the story of who we are. Let's tell our own story. And the starting point being that nobody can still tell my story the way I would want it to be told.
Angelo, do we have the capacity to actually counter these stories as African media?
Yes, I think partly there needs to be complexity. So we need to understand that this isn't just countering Western conceptions of Africa in Western media, but also countering Western conceptions of Africa in African media. And this is particularly the case in some of the most powerfully colonized places, where those who make the meaning are often people who use the paradigms of the West to look at the local spaces that they're in. And the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o had a very, very good phrase for this called colonial alienation, which is that you're a subject indigenous to the space, but you view the space around you through the terms that come from somewhere else. And for too long, particularly in places like South Africa and to a lesser extent in Nigeria, the media look at the local space through the gaze of an other that comes from somewhere else. So you'll have somebody who trained locally, works locally, has never been to the United States, but views the local through the eyes and gaze of a Western subject, because they consume the media products of the West and, understand what news is and how you cover it.
That's an interesting point you raised there about even our own editorial policies in the newsroom reflecting what the Western media is actually reporting about Africa. Now, how do we begin to change that?
I would sort of say it differs slightly. I agree with most of what Angelo said, but I think, and your question, assumes that we need to counter what the West is doing. I'm saying if we do that, then we fall into the same trap. Then the conversation or the narrative is still being dictated by the people that are behind you. So it's not countering what the West is saying. It's telling our own story. It's saying what are the things that are taking place on the continent, which it's an amazing tapestry. It's stuff that the West is, if the Western media has not even started looking at.
But do they have an appetite for these positive stories?
They are not our audience. That's the fascinating thing. They are not our audience. We are our own audience. Okay? Our Africans in the diaspora, Africans in the continent, when you started, there's 1.2 billion of us here. We don't know our own story. So it's not, the moment we begin to say we want to counter what the West is saying, we're falling into that trap. We're falling into the agenda of telling the African story the way they would want it to be told. How many people know the fascinating stuff that's happening on the continent? That has never been told. Why? Because it's not relevant to the Western audiences, and that's a critical thing. The
so
Western
there needs to be a balance as well to tell the bad stories and the good stories.
It's not even a balance. The thing is, the Western media writes to the Western audience. The Western audience appetite is for chaos, hunger, poverty. The moment you don't write that story for the Western media, it stops to sell. But the African audience has a hunger for what is an African story.
Angelo, your views on what the African population actually want from the media?
I think there's a variety of stuff going on. So I find it not useful to define an African audience. There are African audiences, and just at the level of language, the languages in which Africans consume information about their world, differs. If we're even only talking about the colonial language legacies, there are differences there. Then there are specific differences to regions that often I think we mistake when we tell stories, because we tend to think inside the nation states of post-colonial Africa. So the Ebola story, for example, shocked many people because they continued to think that things could be contained and explained in Africa along boundaries drawn in the wake of a conference in Berlin in the 19th century. That what we saw was that real relationships on the continent often transgressed national boundaries. And so to explain news phenomena, you needed to understand things that are organizationally not inside a nation state, that cross boundaries, cross borders, and often there are language and or cultural groups that don't belong inside nation states, that transgress those boundaries. So to explain a phenomenon of war, to explain a phenomenon of health, to explain a phenomenon of cultural significance, you might have to look outside of the nation state.
Well, do stay with us and don't go away. We'll be back with more after the break.
The question is Africa in a space where a white person in a leadership position signals something other than what it would have 50 or 60 years ago?
While it might be possible to think about an African identity that isn't hamstrung by race, I think that it is something we have to create, not something we can pretend is realistic right now. I think it's useful to continue to have discussions about what whiteness and blackness do in relation to Africanness. I don't think it's uncomfortable, but I think it's necessary because it would be ahistorical to pretend that it doesn't matter. And I know that many countries that are not kind of former settler colonies, right, like to pretend that race isn't an issue, but race has a lot to do with who Africans are today.
The death of Zambia's President Michael Sata earlier this year presented Zambians with an unlikely leadership challenge. Can an African country be ruled by a white leader in the modern post-colonial age? There was certainly some mixed reaction to that question in Zambia.
I don't have any problem with Vice President Guy Scott acting as president in Zambia, because basically the party itself, as Patriotic Front, they have him as a vice president, and the constitution stipulates that in case of demise of the incumbent, the vice president takes over. So I don't see any problem with that.
When we say Mr. Guy Scott should be the president, that will simply mean we are bringing back colonialism, we are bringing back the old days, because even in the whites, they'll even have more power over us, because the president, if the president will be a white, even the white will come and take over. Do we want to bring back colonialism in Zambia? No.
It's not right. 50 years after independence, I think we're supposed to have our own indigenous person acting in that position, because this actually puts the country in a very awkward position, you see. So I think in the PF they're going to have a crisis because they did not actually set a standard.
Well, varying views on this issue, but let's start with you, Angelo. 5 decades of independence in Zambia, yet when he was named interim president, there was a lot of disapproval. Is Africa ready for white leadership?
I don't think that it is a question of is Africa ready for white leadership. The question is Africa in a space where a white person in a leadership position signals something other than what it would have 50 or 60 years ago. And I don't think that the African space is at that point yet, because decolonization is neither complete, nor is it a process of just suggesting that this is a deracialized or a post-racial Africa. We're nowhere near there. There are struggles across the continent, particularly in ex-British colonies like Zambia, like South Africa, where whiteness and its benefits under the colonial regime haven't stopped simply because of a post-colonial black government.
Trevor, your thoughts on that?
I think I agree with Angelo. For as long as, race in Africa still represents one's status in society, and indeed is linked to one's having benefited from colonialism, is going to continue to be a problem. But one wishes that we could walk over that stage and begin to recognize leadership that resides in a person, regardless of their race, color, their creed, and simply say, do they have something to offer?
So how do we begin to reshape the minds of Africans?
Well, education is one thing, which goes back to a point that Trevor made earlier, which is what do we know about the continent we live on, its diversity, its complexity, its histories and its contemporary present issues. So for many people sitting on the continent, particularly the elites who sit on the continent, we understand the continent often not through knowledge generated from the continent. This is a point that Mahmoud Mamdani, the professor of African Studies and Politics, who was at the time at the University of Cape Town, but before that at Kampala, was saying about the ways in which we teach Africa to Africans in Africa. We often use textbooks and scholarship from North America or Europe. We understand the differences in Africa as they were articulated by colonial and missionary scholars and interpreters. And it's time for us to begin to rethink knowledge systems and to map Africa very differently from the way in which it has been mapped for us in Berlin in the 19th century. The nation state is not a liberatory thing to think inside of. It is something that is useful in the short term, but we must begin to think through it.
Whose task is it to do that?
It's the task of teachers, it's the task of university academics, of storytellers, and people are doing it. You know, if you look at novels, if you look at poems, they don't stick to the bounded nation. If you look at the imagination of writers like No Violet Bulawayo, if you look at the imagination of somebody like Adichie, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, it's not bounded by the state. It doesn't say the state doesn't exist, but it refuses to tell a nationalist narrative that tells the story from, you know, colonial occupation to liberation inside the nation state. That Africa, in that sense, is messy because we did not just have fights inside nation states, that we are grateful because we could cross boundaries, that the liberation movements of one state housed itself in another state in order to effect liberation in a second or third state, that language groups, cultural groups, long-standing trade relations across the Sahel, for example, that go back 1,300 years, refuse to be bounded by boundaries, lines in the sand. And I think it's important for us when we tell our stories to remember that and not just to think, well, Pretoria, South Africa, Harare, Zimbabwe, Maputo, Mozambique. What is it about Tsonga speakers on the boundaries that means to explain a story, you might have to cross a boundary and think that responsibility lies in two nation states, not in one?
Yeah, I think an interesting part of what he's saying, the question, who's responsible for that? Under normal circumstances, you would hope that the government, through the Ministries of Education, who drive the syllabus, have an interest in doing that. But if you look at that closely, you find that because these ministries are products of the liberation struggle, they want to tell the story according to the victors of the liberation struggle. And it's going to be revisionist, distorted history. So I think it behoves the academics, the media, the researchers and that kind of stuff, to be given that freedom, to be appropriately resourced, to carry that research that adds onto the knowledge pool that Africans have. That's our biggest deficit. The fact that apart from, you know, the West telling our story through the media, we still rely on Western institutions for data. Look at the Ebola situation, for instance. The Center for Disease Control, based in the US, is the one that gave us these alarmist figures about how many people will be dead by January. Yes. 1.5 million, 500,000 dead and 1.5 million infected. We don't have our own institutions, our own data centers that we rely on. So this telling of the African story is a very complicated thing. It would require resources. It would require us at some point being able...
You're optimistic that things can change.
Well, the journey has started. The journey has started. We've got to start where we are right now. And I think at some point, you know, I'm one of the people who are very quick to admit that we are very hard on ourselves. The journey has started. It's 50 years down the line. We're already beginning to tell our own story. We need to build institutions such as, you know, the institutions as big as institutions that they have in the West to tell our own story. But the journey has begun.
Trevor, hold on to that thought and don't go away, because after the break, we look to the future and ask our panel whether Africa really is rising.
We're going to be seeing more and more of that. Africans confident to confront those that lead them and say, you have not delivered on what you should deliver.
Welcome back. Our conversation with Trevor Liwewe and Angelo Fick continues. Gentlemen, thanks for discussing this topic with us today. Now, when we talk about Africa rising, it's a catchphrase. What exactly does it mean, Trevor?
I think, first of all, we need to remind people that it's one magazine called The Economist that came up with a cover that said the hopeless continent and got us all into total depression. 2 years down the line, the same magazine came up with a cover that says Africa Rising, and we all got excited and started jumping around and telling the Africa Rising story. So it's somebody who's decided that Africa is rising, and they've decided to excite the world and say, this is the next frontier. But is Africa rising? That's the question that you're asking. And I think the evidence on the ground is that some of Africa is rising. There's a lot of countries that are experiencing growth. And if you look at the fastest, out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 7 are African. Okay. Lots of stuff happening around technology, around the African middle class and so forth. But there's still pockets of Africa which are still wallowing in poverty. So it's uneven. But I think the headline, the narrative is a positive one. But here's the thing. Let's not focus entirely on that sexy Africa rising stuff. Let's critique this thing. Let's look at the things that are likely to stop Africa from rising. We've been here before. We've had instances where there was this hope and it was all dashed. What went wrong? And for me as an African, my interest is ensuring that this Africa rising narrative continues and to focus on those things that are going to hold us back, things like governance, things like corruption, focusing, justifiably on issues like the growth of the African middle class, the impact that mobile telephone is having on our continent. So yes, Africa is rising, but somebody else put this label on us. We love it. The evidence says we are rising, but there are pockets that are not rising. What do we do with that?
Angelo.
I agree with Trevor that there are pockets of Africa that are rising spectacularly. So if you are Isabel dos Santos in Angola, you are rising spectacularly. If you're sitting in the South Sudan or you are red as a Somali in Kenya, Africa is not rising for you. If you are sitting in, Burkina Faso, you might think Africa is rising because there's an opportunity for democratization. If you're sitting in the Central African Republic as a Muslim subject, your notion of whether Africa is rising or not is related deeply and intimately with what's immediately around you. And I would hate for us to make generalizing, sweeping statements about Africans as a group, because that is again to replicate exactly the 500 years of generalizations that we are now trying to undo.
So how would you describe the status quo on the continent?
That it's mixed, that it is there for some classes of people, for some countries, for some groups, for some individuals. It is going very well and it has never gone better than it is going now. And for some people, the struggle is still ongoing. But what we have in Africa now is an optimism of the will. What we have are increasingly stronger institutions that need to be made even stronger than they are, like the African Union, which improves somewhat on the Organization for African Unity, like regional organizations like SADC and the West African spaces, and also that we don't have the need any longer to think uniformly, that we can be different, we can have sometimes competing interests, but what holds us together is precisely that 500-year interruption of a complex process that we are now all responding to, and our place in the world on a continent that is in some senses one of the last spaces in the world, in the global south, that we can imagine the world being made differently and more positively than it has been.
Trevor, maybe you can come in here and just add on to what he's talked about when we're looking at determining Africa's future.
I think, go back to that positive vibe on the ground, on the continent. Again, not totally positive. There are certain places where people don't feel as upbeat about the environment as they would have felt, 10, 20 years back. But I think generally you get a sense of a certain awakening relative, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and so forth. But there's an African youth, like I said, which is unburdened by colonialism, which is very positive about the future.
But they've also got their challenges when we talk about unemployment rates.
You raise a very important point. And that point is, how does the rest of Africa begin to rise? It's about inclusive politics, inclusive policies, inclusive governance. We're not yet at that point, which is why Elizabeth dos Santos, stands out like a sore thumb, because the environment is not inclusive. It doesn't allow everybody to be, or not everybody, but a significant part of the population to be raised. But as I sit with you here, I'm very optimistic about Africa. I see, and here I'm going to be guilty of saying Africa. I travel a lot around the continent, and I see an amazing sparkle in the eye concerning a lot of young people that you look at in terms of what their hopes and that kind of stuff. There is places like Burkina Faso, where people stand up and claim their rights. We're going to be seeing more and more of that. Africans confident to confront those that lead them and say, you have not delivered on what you should deliver on education, on health, on roads, infrastructure, and on a livelihood that's going to allow me to send my kids to school and that kind of stuff. So I'm very excited, I'm very positive, and I think we all can play a role in telling this very positive African story.
Well, thank you to my guests, Trevor Ncube and Angelo Fick, for that enlightening discussion. And that brings us to the end of this week's edition of Africa 360. If you would like to add your voice to the discussion on the issues raised, visit our Facebook page, or you can tweet us at Africa360_ENCA. You can also send your emails to Africa360@enca.com. That's all we have for you today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.